My name is Sloan Davenport, and for 7 years, I lived inside a masterpiece. It wasn't my masterpiece, however, it was his. It was a life curated by my husband, Julian, a man whose charm could coax secrets from stone and whose taste was so impeccable that he had woven himself into the very fabric of my world, becoming its chief architect and curator. I was merely the gallery in which his collection was housed. He had filled our Pacific Palisades estate with light and art, each painting a conversation, each sculpture a statement that whispered of wealth and sophistication. Our home, perched on a cliff overlooking the endless blue of the Pacific, was less a house and more a testament to his aesthetic genius. I, the heiress to my late father's technology empire, had always lived a life of quiet structure. The Davenport Foundation, my mother's legacy, was my domain. But Julian, an art consultant with a poet's soul and a shark's ambition, brought the color and vibrancy to our shared life. I had entrusted him with the rest. It was a gradual erosion of my own authority in our personal finances. So subtle, I hadn't even noticed it happening. It began with him offering to handle a minor investment, then our household accounts. And soon, he was the trusted liaison with my family's private bankers. I told myself it was a relief, allowing me to focus on philanthropy. I saw his meticulous attention to detail as a form of profound love. I never once realized I was just the most valuable piece in his collection, an acquisition he was carefully preparing to liquidate. The perfection of our life was on full display at the dinner parties Julian loved to host. He would move through the rooms with an easy grace, a glass of wine in hand, captivating our guests with anecdotes about a new artist. I remember one evening in late autumn, the air crisp with salt from the ocean. The house was filled with the low hum of conversation and the soft notes of a jazz quartet on the terrace. Our guests, mostly couples Julian had cultivated from the art and finance worlds, listened to him with rapt attention. "The key to a truly great collection, like a great life," he said, gesturing towards a painting, "is not just about what you acquire. It's about what you have the courage to let go of." People nodded thoughtfully. I smiled, playing my part as the gracious, silent hostess, the quiet backing for his brilliant performance. He subtly corrected my opinion on a piece of sculpture in front of another couple, smiling as he did it. "Sloan has the heart," he'd said, patting my hand. "I just have the eye." It was a dismissal so elegantly delivered it sounded like a compliment. The illusion, so carefully constructed, began to fray on a single rainy Tuesday. I was looking for a spare key to the wine cellar and found myself searching in the back of his mahogany dresser. In a sock drawer I hadn't looked in for years, my fingers brushed against a small, unfamiliar velvet box. It felt too new to be old and too old to be new, a forgotten thing that was somehow still fresh. It wasn't a gift for me. Our anniversary was months away. Curiosity, a dull and unfamiliar emotion, prompted me to open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, exquisitely crafted cufflink. It was shaped like an Ouroboros, a serpent eating its own tail. The detail was perfect, the gold heavy and real, but a cold, quiet alarm bell went off in my mind. I remembered a conversation from years ago. At a gallery opening, Julian had pointed to a similar symbol and scoffed, calling it the height of intellectual pretension. This wasn't for him. This wasn't his taste, and it certainly wasn't for me. That night, I lay beside him in the dark, the sound of his steady breathing a rhythm that had once soothed me but now felt like the ticking of a clock. The serpent cufflink was a splinter in my mind, a piece of evidence that something was profoundly wrong. The next morning, I began to watch him, not as a wife, but as a silent observer. My world had become a puzzle, and I was looking for the missing pieces. I noticed things I had previously dismissed, the way his phone screen would always be angled away from me, a reflexive movement, the late-night calls he explained away as anxious clients in Dubai, his voice a low, placating murmur. He had a new encrypted folder on his laptop, And when I asked, he smiled his easy smile. "All terribly boring, my love," he'd said. "Sensitive acquisition proposals. Nothing for you to worry about." My first instinct was to look for concrete data. I tried to log into our joint investment accounts. Access denied. My password was no longer valid. I called the private bank, and a polite assistant informed me that the security protocols had been updated last month. Mr. Julian Thorne was now the sole administrator for online access, an upgrade he had initiated to protect our assets. He was protecting them, it seemed, even from me. A few days later, the crack in the canvas split wide open. A new sculpture had appeared in his home office. It was a brutalist bronze piece, all sharp angles, and it was jarringly out of place. He said it was a speculative piece for a client, something he was holding temporarily. But the artist's name echoed in my memory, a discordant note I couldn't place. It felt wrong, just like the cufflink. That evening, after he left for a client dinner, I walked into his office on a chilling impulse. I logged into the Davenport Foundation's art database, my domain. I typed in the artist's name. The results loaded in seconds, painting an ugly picture. The piece had been sold last week through a private transaction. The seller was a boutique gallery in Switzerland, owned by a woman infamous in our circles. She was known as a divorce concierge, a specialist who helped wealthy husbands hide marital assets before filing for divorce. The air in the room grew thick and cold. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. This was a plan. This was a strategy. The shock wasn't just the betrayal. It was the chilling, meticulous professionalism of it all. This was not a crime of passion. This was a corporate takeover of our marriage. My horror solidified when I called Mr. Chen, my head of security. I asked him, in a voice I barely recognized, if it was possible to recover deleted files from Julian's cloud backup. He said it was possible. The next afternoon, he met me in a quiet corner of the botanical gardens and handed me an unmarked tablet. "I suggest you read them somewhere private, Miss Davenport," he said, his face impassive. I sat on a stone bench, surrounded by the scent of roses, and opened the PDF. It was an email thread stretching back 6 months, a conversation between Julian and the gallery owner. They referred to me only as the source. They discussed a timeline to decouple the Davenport assets, optimize the portfolio prior to dissolution, and strategies for mitigating emotional fallout. They were talking about my father's legacy, my entire world, as if it were a hostile merger. I was not a person, but a mind to be excavated. The email wasn't a declaration of war. It was confirmation I was already a casualty in a war I didn't know he was fighting. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The hurt was burned away by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. I didn't cry. I acted. My first and only call was to Arthur Vance. Arthur had been my father's lawyer, his closest confidant, and the executor of his estate. He was a bulldog of a man who viewed my father's company as a sacred trust. He once told me my father was a paranoid genius, a man who built firewalls for fires that hadn't been started yet. I didn't call him from the gardens. I drove to the city, to the old Davenport Tower, and took the private elevator to my father's empty office, surrounded by the scent of old leather and the panoramic view of the city. I called Arthur. He met me there within the hour. I laid out the evidence on the vast mahogany desk. I spoke without emotion, my voice steady. Arthur listened without flinching, his fingers steepled. He read every word. When I finished, he didn't offer condolences. He pushed a century-old leather-bound book across the desk. It was my father's original corporate charter. He turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon. It was titled The Legacy Protectorate. "Your father," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, distrusted charm more than anything. He said it was a currency for men with nothing else to sell, this provision. He and I built the legal framework for it years ago, as a contingency. He called it the emergency glass to be broken. It's ready to be activated, not built from scratch. The provision allowed the primary heir, under proven conditions of hostile fiduciary action, to consolidate all controlling shares of the holding company and every asset under its umbrella into a new, single-purpose legal entity, an entity under my soul, unassailable control. For the next 72 hours, we didn't sleep. We executed a silent, legal coup. Arthur assembled a team of his most trusted corporate lawyers. We worked out of a secure conference room in his firm, fueled by coffee and a cold sense of purpose. It was a blur of documents, signatures, and encrypted calls with banks in London, Zurich, and Singapore. It was my name, Sloane Davenport, on every line, my voice authorizing every transfer. One night, around 3 a.m., as I was reviewing a spreadsheet detailing billions in assets, the sheer scale of it all hit me. This wasn't just money. It was companies, thousands of employees, my father's first patent, my mother's charitable trusts. It was a living, breathing legacy. And Julian had tried to steal it with a smooth smile. The thought no longer made me sad. It made me furious. And that fury was a powerful fuel. On the third day, late in the afternoon, the final document was signed. The fortress was built. Arthur and I stood by the conference room window, looking out at the city. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a frantic text from my private banker. The message read, "Sloane, Julian is here. He's trying to use his power of attorney to authorize a wire of $10 million to an account in the Cayman Islands. He is being arrogantly insistent." I took a breath and typed back. His power of attorney was revoked 10 minutes ago, along with every other privilege. Please inform him of that, and have security escort him from the building if he refuses to leave. I showed the phone to Arthur. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. "The vulture," he said, "has landed on an empty branch. We had beaten him by minutes." That evening, I prepared for the confrontation. I called the household staff and told them to take a paid weekend off. The house was unnervingly silent. I walked through the rooms, touching the smooth surfaces of the sculptures. They were no longer objects of beauty, but evidence of a crime. I chose my dress carefully, a simple, elegant sheath of navy blue. It felt like armor. I placed the folder Arthur had prepared on the marble coffee table. Then I waited. Julian arrived home carrying a bottle of vintage champagne, the picture of celebratory calm. "For us," he said, holding up the bottle, "to new beginnings." He sat me down in the living room. With a practiced sigh, he slid a single, elegantly printed letter across the table. It was from his lawyer, a notice of his intent to file for divorce. "I think this is for the best. Sloane," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We've grown apart. I've set up a generous settlement to ensure you're taken care of. We both know you are never comfortable with the financial side of things." I let him finish his entire rehearsed speech. I watched his performance, the feigned sadness in his eyes. When he was done, the silence stretched. Then, I pushed the folder I had placed there earlier towards him. "You should read this," I said. He opened it. Inside was the formal notice of the activation of the Davenport Legacy Protectorate. Behind it, a notice that our prenuptial agreement was now under review for fraudulent inducement. And behind that, a printed copy of his email conversation about the source. He stared at the papers, his face crumbling from confusion to disbelief, then to horror. "What is this? What have you done?" he stammered. I stood up then, looking down at him not with the anger of a betrayed wife, but with the cold clarity of a chief executive officer assessing a catastrophic failed investment. "You were never a partner in my father's legacy, Julian," I said, my voice even and calm. "You were just the curator, and your exhibition is over." His response was swift and venomous. Within a week, he filed a high-profile lawsuit, accusing me of corporate fraud. He claimed we had a verbal agreement to build a joint art fund and that I had illegally moved our shared assets. He produced forged documents, co-signed by a shady appraiser named Renee Gallus, creating a paper trail for a partnership that never existed. It was a public attack, designed to paint me as a thief and force me into a settlement through humiliation. He had underestimated me, and he had profoundly underestimated Arthur Vance. The depositions were grueling. I sat in a sterile conference room for hours as Julian's lawyers tried to portray me as a clueless, vindictive heiress, with Arthur by my side. I answered every question with cold, hard facts. When it was Julian's turn, Arthur's cross-examination was a masterclass. He dismantled Julian's lies, one by one, catching him in a web of contradictions until Julian was visibly sweating under the pressure. The court date arrived on a bright summer morning. I walked into the courtroom with Arthur by my side. I wore the same navy blue dress, across the room. Julian looked like a shadow of the man I had married. His bespoke suit seemed to hang off him, his confidence replaced by a twitchy anger. The proceedings were almost clinical. Arthur's team presented their evidence with devastating precision. They brought in forensic accountants who proved the documents were forgeries. They exposed Gallo's long history of art fraud. They presented the time-stamped evidence of Julian's attempted $10 million wire transfer. The judge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, looked at Julian with unconcealed contempt. The case was dismissed with prejudice. And in a final blow, she ordered Julian to cover all of my astronomical legal fees and announced her court was launching a criminal investigation into his conspiracy with Gallo. He was not just defeated, he was ruined. After the hearing, he tried to approach me in the marble hallway of the courthouse. "Sloan," he began, his voice a low hiss. "You didn't have to do this." I stopped and looked him straight in the eye for the last time. "No, Julian," I said quietly. "You didn't." Then I turned and walked away, and I did not look back. In the months that followed, I didn't just find peace, I found my power. I formally took my father's seat at the head of the boardroom table, not as a silent heiress, but as the active chairwoman of Davenport Industries. The position felt right, the weight of it familiar. My first executive action was to reverse a plan Julian had encouraged, a plan to sell off my father's original R&D division. I reinvested in it instead. My second act was to have art movers quietly come to the house. They took down every piece Julian had ever acquired. The walls were bare, and for the first time, the house felt like it was truly mine. I watched the live stream of the auction where his prized pieces were sold. The final item was a portrait of me he had commissioned, a painting of a serene woman I no longer recognized. With the proceeds, I started a new foundation, dedicated to supporting emerging female artists. One evening, I stood in the now minimalist living room, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. I finally understood. Julian had looked at my life and seen a safety net, a fortune to be exploited. He never realized that my father's legacy wasn't a safety net. It was my armor, and it was always, always mine to command.